Today's live stream from Aasim Iftekhar covered several topics, but one discussion stood out above all the others: the problem of evil. A caller repeatedly asked why God allows so much suffering in the world. Aasim's response was essentially that Allah has no obligations. God is all-powerful and sometimes intervenes, but He is not required to stop evil. Human beings possess free will, and God generally permits them to exercise it. I want to summarize his position fairly before explaining why I ultimately remain unconvinced. This isn't a response driven by emotion alone. It's a question about what the world would actually look like if Islam's description of Allah were true. The livestream began with an explanation of three categories of disagreement within Islam. First, there are beliefs whose rejection places someone outside Islam altogether. Second, there are disagreements with established Sunni principles that may not amount to disbelief, but are still considered serious deviation. Third, there are legitimate scholarly disagreements where respected scholars may disagree while remaining within Orthodox Islam. Aasim used the differences between the classical schools of jurisprudence as examples of the third category. The discussion then shifted to callers. The first caller asked a question that many believers and non-believers have asked throughout history. If God has no needs, why did He create the world? Aasim replied that the question misunderstands God's nature. Allah has no needs, so asking what need creation fulfills is a category mistake. Humans exist to worship God, but God gains nothing from our existence. The conversation then moved to what I believe was the most important part of the stream. The caller asked why Allah allows so much suffering. He mentioned war, he mentioned Palestine, he mentioned innocent people dying. He asked why an all-powerful God does not intervene. Aasim's answer was that Allah gave human beings free will. Human beings choose evil. God is under no obligation to prevent every evil act. Sometimes He intervenes, as in the story of Pharaoh, but generally He allows history to unfold according to His wisdom. Later, another caller challenged how we know Islam is true. Aasim argued that Islam is not based on blind faith, but on knowledge. He maintained that reason allows us to know certain attributes about God, that He is eternal, independent, all-knowing, and not bound by time or space, and only then do we examine revelation. Whether you agree or disagree, that was the basic structure of his arguments. Now, I want to explain why I still find the problem of evil one of the strongest reasons for doubting Islam. There's one sentence from the live stream that stayed with me: Allah has no obligation. At first, that might sound reasonable. But the more I think about it, the more disturbing it becomes. Let's imagine something. Imagine I witnessed a 7-year-old girl being attacked. I have unlimited power. I can stop it instantly. No risk, no cost, no sacrifice. I simply raise my hand and the attacker disappears. Instead, I watch. I do nothing. The girl suffers. She dies. How would you judge me? Would anyone call that mercy? Would anyone say, well, he wasn't obligated? Of course not. We condemn that person immediately. Why? Because compassion naturally creates responsibility. The greater your ability to help, the greater your moral responsibility to help. Yet somehow, when we start talking about God, the rules suddenly change. Now we're told He has no obligation. But why? Why should morality become weaker precisely where power becomes infinite? The most common answer is free will. People choose evil. Fine. I agree that people make terrible choices. Rapists choose to rape. Murderers choose to murder. Terrorists choose to kill. But I rarely hear anyone ask the obvious follow-up question: what about the free will of the victim? We spend enormous amounts of time defending the freedom of the criminal, almost none defending the freedom of the child whose life is destroyed. Could an all-powerful God not preserve both? Could He not stop a rape without eliminating human freedom altogether? Could He not stop a murder moments before it happens? Could He not prevent genocide? After all, Muslims themselves believe God sometimes intervenes. Aasim himself mentioned Pharaoh. If God occasionally intervenes, then intervention itself cannot be the problem. The real question becomes, why intervene so rarely when the suffering is so immense? Even if someone accepts the free will defense, It explains only part of reality. What about earthquakes, floods, childhood cancer, parasites, children born with agonizing diseases, animals being eaten alive, millions of years of predation, entire ecosystems where survival depends upon killing other living creatures? Human free will didn't design that system. If God exists, he did. And when I step back and look at the whole picture, I don't see isolated tragedies. I see a world where suffering is woven into the fabric of life itself. Millions of Muslims sincerely pray. Parents pray, children pray, entire communities pray. Every year, millions gather during Hajj asking Allah for mercy and relief for suffering Muslims across the world. Yet wars continue. Children continue dying. Families continue grieving. Again, I'm not claiming prayer never helps anyone. I'm simply asking what I would expect to observe if an all-powerful, perfectly merciful God were actively intervening in history. Because honestly, this world doesn't look like that to me. For me, the difficulty doesn't end with this life. Islam teaches that those who knowingly reject God face eternal punishment. This is perhaps the hardest doctrine for me to reconcile with divine mercy. Suppose someone sincerely examines the evidence and concludes Islam isn't true. Suppose someone grows up in another religion and never becomes convinced. Would a perfectly merciful God really burn that person forever? Infinite punishment for finite beings. I struggle to see how endless conscious torment could ever be an expression of perfect mercy. Some people think that atheists enjoy criticizing religion. I don't. If a perfectly loving, perfectly merciful God truly exists, I would welcome that reality. The problem is, when I compare the description of Allah to the world I actually observe, they don't seem to match. Muslims tell me Allah is more merciful than any mother. But what mother, possessing unlimited power, would watch her child drown if she could save them? What mother would watch her child be abused, or starve, or become so overwhelmed by suffering that they end their own life, if she could stop it instantly? Wouldn't we expect God to be even more compassionate, not less? Ultimately, this is why I remain unconvinced. The issue isn't that God lacks power. Islam certainly doesn't teach that. The issue is that the explanations I hear often seem to preserve God's power by sacrificing his mercy. I keep hearing that God has no obligation, that he permits suffering for reasons beyond our understanding, that his ways are higher than ours. Perhaps, but from where I stand, that doesn't resolve the problem, it deepens it. Because if this world, with all its wars, rapes, diseases, disasters, unanswered prayers, and unimaginable suffering, is exactly what perfect mercy looks like, then I no longer know what the word mercy means. Thanks for watching.